Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this screening of Rebel Hearts. Uh, Pedro Kos is with us, the director of the film, and is going to be with us for the next half hour or so, or however long. Um, we have questions and comments from those of you. Pedro, welcome, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here and with all our friends in Utah.
Do you want to start there with the influence of the Utah Film Center of Gerald Dreyfus? We were talking a little bit off the air a moment ago about just the impact of that. Do you want to say something about that really quick?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, Rebel Hearts would not exist without the Utah Film Center. We would not be here um, and without Gerald Dreyfus. Gerald is such an extraordinary force and such a center, a hub, an extraordinary hub of this documentary community, and sees understands the power that films and the documentary films can have in all its different forms. And actually, Geraldine has a connection to Corita. Her mother was very much inspired and influenced by the works of Sister Corita, and had Coritas at home. Actually, I believe the one that is called Daisy, that has a lot of yeses that goes around in a circle.
Yeah.
Apparently, that was in Geraldine's mom's home growing up. So Geraldine knew, automatically when I told her about Sister Corita, that I was making this film. She's like, "Oh my God, Sister Corita! I grew up, with her works," and she was already a fan. So she has been just an extraordinary supporter, and I'm so honored and proud to have her as one of the co-executive producers on this film, and the Utah Film Center being our fiscal sponsor. So we are actually overjoyed and really enthusiastic about that.
Pedro, let's talk a little bit about, you shared some of this story when we spoke on the radio last week, but say a little bit about, I know that Shawnee Isaac Smith, of course, the producer of the film, this was an idea that came to her, gosh, 20, 25 years ago. But talk about the time when it came to you and how that transfer, this was her passion project for a while. This was something she was passionate about. Talk a little bit about how she got you involved and how it became a project, a passion project for you.
Absolutely. It was in the fall of 2015 that Shawnee and a good friend of mine, Kira, who's also one of the other producers on the project, approached me about with these materials, with this story. And Shawnee Isaac Smith, by the way, for those of who are watching, is our extraordinary writer producer who really began this the journey to tell the story of these extraordinary women over 20 years ago. Through a mutual friend, she had known about the Immaculate Heart Sisters for a while, but through a mutual friend met the community and heard the stories and said that this has to be documented. And at that time, most of them were alive and well, like Anita and Pat Reef and Miriam Sharples. I mean, the list goes on. And Shawnee was able to interview those extraordinary women and amass this extraordinary treasure trove of firsthand accounts from these women. And sadly, they most of them, a lot of them have are no longer with us, but approached me in 2015, and end of 2015. I was still working on a film called Bend in the Arc, finishing up that at that moment in time. And I fell in love with the story, and it spoke to me on a very personal level because I grew up I'm Brazilian. I grew up in Brazil. Brazil is a very Catholic country. I grew up Catholic. I was raised Catholic. Um, and I say that in all honesty, that the battle lines of the conservative and the progressive sides of Catholicism run right through me. It was something that I experienced firsthand because my parents at that time were not officially married. I was born in the late 70s. I was born in 1977. At that point in time, there was no divorce in Brazil. And when my parents, got together or married, they were not able to get married officially in the church. And that was a big scandal in many ways. Is, oh no, you're going against the tenets of the church. And so I was born in a silly way out of wedlock, and I even though my parents are still together today, they've been together for 44 years.
Wow.
But it was something that at that point in time, there were, I don't say this in jest, there were friends of my grandmother that told it, my grandmother, that she would rather have a daughter die than to be married to a divorcee. I mean, yes, that was probably a hyperbole, but it was something that was not looked in kindly on. And so my parents did experience blowback, and myself being gay Brazilian and growing up, being told, being taught that what part of who I was evil and was sinful. And then there was the other side, the other side of the family, which was more progressive, about really about inspired by the message of, of the teachings of loving thy neighbor, compassion and forgiveness, which is, so much of what we are taught. And that is a long-winded way to say that once I heard the story of their imaginations, of these extraordinary women, of how they were moved by their faith to stand up to an institution that they saw was in the wrong, I admired, I was inspired by their courage. And I wish I had known that example earlier in my life. And it was something that I felt really called to do. I mean, it was on a very, very personal level of something that opened, my eyes and my imagination of what was possible. And they did it. They were pioneers and they were prophets, as Clem Connolly says in the film.
Yeah. Do you think, Pedro, it's interesting, the personal dimension here now that you brought to this film, and Shawnee as well, of course, being raised Catholic also. But one of the things you've talked about is that it's really, broadly, it's about change.
Yeah.
How change happens. In fact, I think you've described it as a meditation on change. And that gives it even more of an angle, knowing that you are personally invested in the story in some way. So I'm wondering, when the idea of change came to you as a theme, did you set out to make it about that? Did it develop as you were cutting in those things?
It's interesting because in the process of making a documentary, a lot of the ideas and themes are born out organically throughout the process. Maybe they're not there from the get-go.
Right.
And there are examples of that within this film, but actually change, it was something that was right there from the get-go. This meditation on change, it was something that was sort of obvious and percolated to the surface, even from my first exposure to the materials. Because what the Immaculate Heart Sisters were doing, they were responding to a call to change. That was Vatican II, right? When they read those decrees that came out of Vatican II, they were inspired, and something that actually they were have already been doing. Is to be a part of the world. As educators, they felt really responsible to impart on a new, generations and upon generations of young women to be the best versions of themselves, to live their fullest, to their fullest potential, not only of their fellow nuns. And that's something we can talk about, because that's how Corita came to be. That's how, like, all these extraordinary women, came to each of their talents and were paired with each of the talents, but also to their students, like Rosa, who you see, who was really taught to follow their conscience. And so going back to change, in a way, that is how, like, they were called to be a part of the world. They were called to reform. They felt that that was, at that time in the 60s, which is a time of so much of upheaval and change, that they needed to to help the community, to be of service. And how to be of service, you need to be connected to the people you're serving. And I mean, I can even quote Pope Francis. When he became Pope, he said the church needs to be like a field hospital. You need to be, in order to live out the words of the gospel, that's what you need to be, a part of the world. And that's what they felt really called to do. And so they stood up for that, and they suffered because of that. But if you look at all the great stories of change, they are always really painful. They're always faced with enormous obstacles, because a lot of times it is much easier to stay the way things are, right?
Yeah.
It is it's very scary to go to somewhere that's unknown. What would it mean to take off your habit, or to give freedom to, like, even the little things. It's, many of the church was like, well, that's just a slippery slope. They're
Right.
disobeying their vows.
Right.
What's going to happen?
Well,
And I'll play the devil's advocate in a way. Sorry, and I'll
no.
but I'll play devil's advocate in a certain way. Maybe they, like, to their point of view, maybe they think they were right, because look at the number of, they can maybe point to, well, after this, look at the number of women religious in the church. It fell precipitously,
Yeah.
But one can also think it also fell precipitously because the church failed to change, failed to keep up with the times.
Yeah, I think that it's so interesting. The idea of change is basically what you had going on in the film is that people wanted to try to do things differently. And there's this old order that is said, no, things are stable. This is how we've always done them, but people are trying something new. And in that sense, that's what's going on right now. And this is one of the things you've said. You said, we are making a film about now. So maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's interesting. We see Sister Lenore, we see Lenore at this women's march right up front. It's very much in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a deliberate thing. You were trying to,
Yeah.
I think one of the things you've talked about is that you wanted to set it here first. We talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was important to frame the whole film from the lens from where we are today.
Yeah.
It was very important to show how this is a story about us where we are now, because it is a story about change, because it is about questioning these larger structures that govern our lives, in a way that is, in many ways, is very oppressive. In many ways, it is without our participation. It is trying to it's not in a participatory way. So in that way, what they did is exactly, I mean, if you look at the parallels of what we are questioning, maybe it's not the institution of the Catholic Church, but it is these larger these larger issues that we're dealing with from not only government, but sort of societal oppressive forces. And you see, I mean, you also see sort of the Great Awakening in a certain way that many people had last year.
Yeah.
Um,
Like,
I
let's
think,
do something different. What, people rethinking some of these social orders, like, the defunding the police conversation. Now, that means various things, but what some people are saying is, okay, maybe defund the police, or maybe don't defund the police, but do something differently.
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Think outside the box. Think because at the heart of what the Immaculate Heart Sisters were teaching everybody, from their sisters to their students, to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what Rosa keeps saying.
Yeah.
To question authority, to question these structures. How are they because if we're not participating in how these structures govern our lives, then these structures are oppressive structures, and we need to we need to think beyond that. We need to make, in order to make our our world, our society, and all in a way more functional, and better in so many ways, we needed to be more, we needed to reflect our needs, right? We needed to reflect our world and who we are. And that's what they were trying to do. The Immaculate Heart Sisters were trying to basically make the changes that they felt they needed to do in order to be the best teachers, the best educators, the best nurses, the best community, to be a part of that world, right? And they were living in a world of this awakening of civil rights, the world of where, of war, of Vietnam War. What they were called to do was in the world of the farm workers' labor movement in the West Coast, here in the United States. And so they were, how each of them could best contribute to that world, and shape and collectively shape their community. And that's what they did. They felt very empowered amongst themselves to make those changes.
Yeah.
And that's when they ran right into that obstacle of the higher, the higher institution. And I mean,
It's personified by the Cardinal, but
yes,
right. I mean, in that sense, and we'll come back to that in a minute. He's the embodiment of that, and he's a good antagonist in some way. Although you have more empathy for him than that. We'll come to that in a moment. But I wanted to. Here's a question from Stephen, who's been with us tonight. He wanted you to talk about the animation. And so say something, Pedro, if you would, about how you wanted to, I think this is how you've described it, rethink the visual language of the film. And you should talk about your affection when you were a kid with the comics of the Justice League, because this contributes to the kind of visual sensibility for the film.
absolutely. I mean, it began sort of jokingly that, I grew up with the Justice League comics. Both the comic books and then the cartoon as in the 80s, and 70s and 80s. So I used to kid around that these, at first, these women were the real life Justice League. They were just like the Justice League, and the Immaculate Heart College was the Hall of Justice. But that's actually what it that actually spurred, wait, actually they are in many ways, and they have their superpowers, except that instead of putting on their costume, they're actually taking off their habits to gain their superpowers. Yeah. And in a way, that's sort of, that language of visual language was something that sparked an idea, and it immediately led to looking at Karida and thinking, what would Karida do? And we had a lot of archive. One of the big challenges in this film actually turned out to be our greatest opportunity, because we had a lot of archival materials, but there are certain sections of the story that we really were lacking in materials to actually tell, to bring it to life. I want, my goal and as a storytellers is try to make it as immersive of a journey as possible for the audience. And if I have just a couple documents here and there for something, how am I going to make 2 pages of a questionnaire immersive, right?
Right.
And so we were kept then something we began saying in the edit room was like, well, what would Karita do? And that really led to Karita rethought the way she portrayed the Holy Family and also adjusted to restraints that were placed upon her and created a new visual language that that's what makes her one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. And we thought, well, let's tell it in animation, and we began to reach out to think of animators, and Judy Corin, our amazing producer, who I was really lucky to work with on The Great Hack, and she also one of our producers on Rebel Hearts. She had worked with this animator in Montreal, an Icelandic animator based in Montreal, Una Lorentzen, and she's like, I think you'll really connect with Una. And when I saw Una's work, it was very artisanal. It felt like each frame was handcrafted and layered in a really particular way that felt Karita-esque almost, because it had all the beautiful different layers that built up to something that was greater than its parts. And that's what I was really inspired. And when we connected with Una, she was blown away by Karita's artwork, and we really kind of began to dive into what could it look like for each section, for each segment of the story. And we did over 10 minutes of character animation on this project. Wow. And plus all the motion graphics, which also that informed that as well. And along with I have one more visual thing to mention, that along with the Justice League, the Immaculate Heart College had a publication called the Irregular Bulletin, which is a really tongue-in-cheek sort of magazine newsletter that they did, which we visually reference a lot of times in how we call them the audio visualizations. When we have that extraordinary audio of their meetings and their assembly, we looked at that Irregular Bulletin and sort of the style of how the text is irregular, like slanted, and how it comes on, and that is really also taken from the sisters. I mean, everything we try to be as organic to the story and as tactile as possible, like where you really feel the film, where you feel that texture of that paper, and feel the texture of the paint coming on the serigraph. That was really important to us, to capture that immediacy of these materials.
I wanted to ask you about something that I thought was so effective, and I'm hoping it was intentional. I'm guessing it was. Throughout the film, we come to know Sister Karita, but we don't hear her until almost the end of the film. We don't actually hear her speak, or at least not that much. And I have to say, it was such a nice revelation. We knew who she was. We saw her, doing all of her work. We saw all of that footage of her doing that and smiling, and of course, but then there's that moment at the end, toward the end, where she speaks, and I thought that was such a nice reveal. Talk a little bit about that. Did you decide to let's hold off on that, because I thought it worked for me anyway. I thought it was really cool.
It was intentional in many ways. Karita passed away in 1986, so there was no definitive interview.
There was no interview, right? Yeah.
There are interviews with her, and actually you hear her voice earlier on. There was a wonderful audio interview that's from the UCLA archives that we kind of string throughout, that you hear throughout a little bit. And there's one sort of I think late 50s or early 60s TV show that she was on that we kind of pepper in, but very, it's literally like a tease.
Yeah.
And then, but one of the things that I'll say is actually what was very intentional is that the first time you really kind of land with her is actually when she doesn't say, she's asked that question, why did she leave?
Yeah.
And what do you she actually doesn't speak. So the first time you really are with her, she doesn't speak. She doesn't have the words to express how hurtful that part of the story was. And then at the end, she leaves us with with her beautiful line about when we sweep things under the rug, they don't just stay there, they get worse. And that's coming back to what we're talking about, things that we're dealing with today, the things that we keep sweeping under the rug as a society, as individuals, as a community. They're not going to just stay there. They, like Karita says, they're going to get worse. And we saw that, we have so many reminders of that we see every day. But Karita was an artist. She embodied in so many ways the spirit of what the Immaculate Hearts were about, and her artwork was dialoguing very directly with what was going on in those times.
I'm excited for people to rediscover her work. I have to say, I didn't know it hardly at all. I mean, it looked very familiar once I saw it. I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I think people are going to rediscover that, and it's marvelous. It's so great. And it's such a part of the film. That's one thing I'm really excited about, is that people are going to rediscover not just this incredible order of nuns, but this amazing artist.
And a really I'm so happy you say that, because an artist who I really feel is very overdue to be recognized for her contribution. I mean, I really think she's made a huge mark in the latter half of the 20th century, and is, and everyone knows who Andy Warhol is, but no one knows, not no one knows, but there's a lot less people who I think know who Sister Karita is, and everyone knows who Andy Warhol is, and I feel she is definitely on par and should be as known as as Andy Warhol and Rauschenberg and the other great pop artists of the time.
Honestly, yeah, I think that's right. Here's a question that comes from Abigail, who she asks this: how do you suppose long-held religions always fall into what feels like stubborn conservative mindsets? Abigail writes, when figures like Christ and others are so revolutionary and so counterculture for their time. I think this is a really great question, because it's something that you've talked about, Pedro, the idea that that for these sisters, and for Rosa in particular, the Catholic Church is their home. They don't want to leave. They want to reform it. I think you describe it as radical reclamation. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, it is something that, as someone also who was raised in the Catholic, despite everything, someone who was raised in Catholic,
despite not feeling exactly welcome, I'm guessing.
Exactly. Yeah. It is home, because it informs so much of culturally who you are, personally the values that you're raised with, at least I was, and it goes beyond the institution. It comes, I think it's really a question of faith, right? And And that's actually something that I have to ask I have to thank my parents for, to be able to separate the faith from the institution.
Mm.
Because the institution, and Helen Kelly, by the way, who in her interview said something very similar that my parents said, that she was always taught to, you have to keep an eye on the institution, as Helen Kelly said. An institution that sometimes equates not eating meat on Fridays as great a sin as, you know, something that a lot worse. You have to take it with a grain of salt, and that's the way I think we are, that I was raised. Actually, I was raised to really see, you know, faith is something that is greater than any institution. It is something that unites us, and it's supposed to unite us all, as, you know, even though we all have our own different faiths, but it's something that's supposed to get to the core of our common humanity, right? To really who we are and why we're here. And in a way helps us to tackle these greater questions about our existence, about our roles, and on the, you know, on in this life and on this planet and beyond. And if that's something that's ingrained with you from this, you know, culturally through your life, if that's taken away from you, that is, you know, it feels like an exile in a certain way. So I agree with Rosa. It is it is our home, the church. But when the church, it means the church as like as a group of people, as not as the institution. And I think in regards to an institution, your viewer was very correct. It's interesting how the more conservative and trying to preserve the status quo, a lot of times wins or how can I say this, is wins the day, or it becomes more, you know, in charge. Well, I think that's gets back again to something that's very a very basic human quality, you know, which is fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what Rosa says. It is something that's born out of fear of so many different things, and fear of change, fear of losing power, of losing, you know, privilege, of being cast aside, cast away. You know, the list goes on, but I think it is so much out of fear, and, you know, Rosa beautifully says that about McIntyre.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, say something, Pedro, if you would. We talked about this on the radio last week, but this really lovely empathy you're applying to Cardinal McIntyre, which I think is really laudable, because I think it is easy for people to see him as the villain in this film, but you see him as, sure, he's an antagonist. He is the old guard. He's the one who wants to fire these ladies who are just trying to get involved and get engaged in the world. But one thing you've talked about is that everything that he knew was being turned upside down. These nuns represented the thing that he feared the most. And so it seems like you just have this sense of empathy for what he might have been going through as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to, you know, put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and I actually, for McIntyre, the person who helped me put myself in his shoes was Anita Caspery, actually.
Wow.
Anita, in her book Witness to Integrity, which by the way is an extraordinary book, and I read right, as I was beginning the project, and was just, that also really helped cement the fact that I had um, to help tell the story. But Anita talks about in her book and in her interview um, that with Shawnee, that McIntyre was really a product of of his upbringing and of the time. When McIntyre went to seminary in the late teens, early 1920s, there was a real backlash from any sort of intellectualism of the church, of fostering an open questioning students. It was literally the opposite of what Immaculate Heart College was. It was limiting the number of books. You were not supposed to read philosophy. That was a major no. The theological studies. It was about a black and white war, a black and white world and a black and white faith where there was a right and a wrong, and there was a one way to salvation. And in a way, if you are a part of that hierarchy, and everyone in the church plays a role in their way to salvation, right? And if you do X, Y, and Z, then you're guaranteed, your entrance into heaven, into the afterlife. And in a way, I think McIntyre saw that as that was what was instilled in him in his education. And he's someone who, his father had an accident when he was a child and was not able to support his family. So McIntyre had to start working at a very early age as a runner on Wall Street. That's where he attained all his business acumen. And he worked hard. I mean, he was a very dedicated man who unfortunately was not the most well-educated person because exactly of that mentality at that time, which frowned upon educating their priests or their clergy too much. That was dangerous. And so that was the way he was brought up, and that's the way he was formed. And so naturally, he sees his worldview as very black and white. And when these sisters come up in LA and are about education and teaching critical thinking and empowering their women students to be leaders, and their sisters, and sending their sisters to get PhDs and masters in secular institutions. Oh my God. Oh no, like in Stanford and MIT and Columbia and RISD. I mean, you name it, like they were sending their sisters who were going to be college professors to the best institutions in the country. Anita has a PhD in literature from Stanford University. Wow. Lenore has a MFA from film from Columbia University. So
yeah,
that's what happens, and that's why he was, and he was well advanced in his years by the 60s came along. So he was not a fan of Vatican II when that came around, and surely it was scandalized by what the Immaculate Heart Sisters were doing, which to him went against every single thing I think he believed. So.
Well, Pedro, you've been so generous with your time. Let me just read a few comments we've received. Tanya wanted to say she really liked the archival footage. It really does bring obviously the story to life. Libby, mentioned the score really added to the production. Julie found it fabulously inspiring. Wanted to thank you. Let me just ask you finally before we wrap up. So this is happening in Los Angeles.
Yes.
But what was happening elsewhere for nuns in different parts of the world, in the sense that what influence do you think these sisters in this place really had on the church at large and nuns at large and really the culture?
Oh, so many things, but it's a bit of a tiered question. So one of the things that I think at that time, there was a movement for reform. And so LA happened to have a Cardinal McIntyre, who was the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, who was very conservative. Other archdioceses that didn't have such conservative cardinals were not, the orders of sisters were also reforming in those places as well, and they didn't run into the troubles that the Immaculate Heart Sisters did, because this issue didn't come to a head the way it did here. They were definitely, the Immaculate Heart Sisters were definitely some of the first ones, some of the first orders to try to reform, but they were not the only one. But one of the things that really set them apart was their education, their emphasis on education. And they were, they had more advanced degrees among them than all the priests in Los Angeles combined. They actually were one of the most highly well-educated orders in the country, period. And I think that's why I think that really sets this story apart, and what really propels the story, because by the time Vatican II came along and all those reforms, they were so ready, because they were keeping up. They read everything. They were such already part of the world. Immaculate Heart College was already sort of a cultural hub in Los Angeles. Their art department, with Carita and Mary Magdalene, brought in like the great minds of the time to speak at the college. They brought in professors from England and Ireland to teach, to direct plays. They were being published. They were, publishing in scientific journals. I mean, the list goes on. And that is because of their very strong emphasis on education. And that's something that was with the order from almost from their get-go in the 1840s in Spain, and then they came to California in the 1870s. And because they were so far apart from their Spanish original mother house, or the original order back in Spain, they had to, and California was still very much developing. They had to be pioneers. They had to fend for themselves, and they always were very self-starters. And I think that's at the core of what this order was about. And that led to, always a strong emphasis on education, and it just kept building with each subsequent Mother General. Anyway, that was I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's great. One final thing, and this question always comes up. People want to know how they can share this film. So say something about that finally.
Yes, so we will be playing in a number of festivals, that are coming up throughout the spring. Cleveland International Film Festival next in a couple weeks, and then in Canada at Hot Docs, and then there will be some more festivals to come after that. And then we are very excited that we've partnering with, we've been acquired by Discovery Plus, and we will be released this year. So check out our website, rebelheartsfilm.com, for updates on our release, and will be sooner than later in a way. We're looking sometime over the summer, but yes, definitely keep tabs with it. Sign up for our mailing list and updates at rebelheartsfilm.com.
Great. We'll put a link to that on our website and the Utah Film Center website as well. And congratulations, I did see that news. So that's terrific. That's really great. So
we're very, very excited.
Pedro Kos, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been such a pleasure. And thanks everyone for sticking around to hear from this terrific filmmaker about this really terrific film. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Good night. Good night.